This is a map of the place where I spent my childhood and my adolescence. You can probably see there are two villages called Arley there. There's New Arley and Old Arley. 20 miles that way is the city of Birmingham, and 10 miles that way is Coventry. So we're in the heart of the English Midlands. And New Arley's so cool because it was built in response to the sinking of a mine shaft in 1905. And that pit was, it was sunk in 1905. And they, for about 63 years, they mined a seam of coal called the Warwickshire Thick. And in the 30s, there was a need for labour. There was a labour shortage. And so men and families moved from the northeast to the Midlands in response to this shortage. And that's where my mother's family came to be here in New Arley. That pit closed in the late 60s. And it had defined the place, it had made the place. And the predominantly men who worked there, they scattered to the car industry in Birmingham and Coventry. And so the village began, even in the late 60s, the village began to lose a sense of itself. Even though a new colliery opened just down the road and some of the men went to work there, something had fundamentally changed at that point. And my mother was born and bred in the village. She moved away for work, and we moved back when I was about 3 years old. And I spent my childhood and my adolescence there. And I'll start on the next slide. These slides are on for about a minute, but what I want to try and do is explain, when I go to talks like this, what I like to sort of hear is the way that projects, how they start, kind of what they're about, and also how they're pursued or how they're worked. So I thought that that's probably what I'd like to talk about today. So really the project is based around a memory and a sort of thing, a kind of a situation, and that is that when I was a kid, when I was about 7 or 8 years old, there was a travelling family that moved in to the outskirts of the village, and one day I went to school, and the children of this travelling family were at our school, and it was a really small village school, and I walked in one morning, and all my schoolmates had surrounded this boy and this girl and were chanting gypsy at them, and I couldn't figure out what was going on at first. I thought it was a game of some sort, and eventually I kind of figured out what was going on, and it's left me with this sort of sense of, I suppose, when I think about this, it's a sense of kind of being ill at ease or disquiet. The next thing to say is that, my extended family lived in the village too, and my cousin, who was the same age as me, so we were at school together. And he and my sister were the brightest kids in the school. And he had a sort of difficult family background. When he was 16, to get away from his family, he joined the Marines. And this was at the age when I was just sort of beginning to sort of get interested in photography and starting to make sort of pictures and think about pictures. A few months later, he bought himself out of the Marines, and he started to work at a job in the Forestry Commission, a job outside, that he really loved. And he did that for a number of years. And when he was 20, I went to farm, the person who was at farm. When he was 20, his father, who was a very difficult man, he was a bully actually, organised a job for him in the pit. So he went from this job that he loved, out in the air and the light, to work in a coal mine. And that is where he spent his working life. And his job he's called a ripper, and what his job is to force the coal face forward. So he works at the very front of kind of mining, I suppose. And every every day his journey to work, he goes. It's an 8-minute journey down in a lift. Then he takes a train ride for 40 minutes, and then he walks 2 miles, and then he starts work. So this kind of a sort of disjunction between his life and my life are sort of at the heart of this work, I suppose. It sort of started. I started this sort of project a number of years ago, in 2001, and it's developed and it's changed. And at first, I thought that the work was about these things, about industry and about, to an extent, going home and all of these sorts of issues. And it's changed. I mean, it's nearly 13 years that I've been working on it. And I guess that the thing about it is that for a long time I was doing it, and I was going there, and I was spending all my spare time away from the work that I do for kind of money. I was spending all my spare time going there and photographing. I photographed using a 5.4 camera, which is something that I'd kind of become fluent with as a student. And I was going there and I was making these pictures. And I think that the really important thing for me was that, in retrospect, I didn't know why I was there. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know why. It was a very indistinct path. I knew that I had to go there. I knew that I had to make the journey there. So I'd get on the train from London. I live in London. So I got on the train from London and would get to the village. And it wasn't a very easy thing to do, I have to say, at first, because I suppose that then I was, and I still am, distrustful of my own motives when making photographs. It's a very difficult sort of thing to do for me. So I would drag myself out of the house and into the village to make these pictures without really having much of an idea why I was doing it. But it got sort of, it got to a sort of point of, it was as if I couldn't help but go and couldn't help but take pictures and couldn't help return there again and again. And it got to a point about 8 years, 7 or 8 years in, that I'd amassed a lot of work, about 4,500 exposures, and it sort of, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go with it. I didn't know where it would sort of take me next. So I put it all away. I put it away for about a year, I think. And I went back to these boxes. They're in a room in my house, and I went back to these boxes. And the thing that struck me about it, when I started looking at the contact sheets, first of all, was how bad a lot of the work was. But second of all, was that it was clearly the work of somebody with trying to work something out. It was clearly the work of someone with a problem in some ways. And I started to look through it, and I started to try and kind of figure out what was going on, and I started to photograph it again. And going back there, something that I don't know if any of you have this, but photographing for me, because I'm very conscious of the history of photography, and I'm very conscious of kind of other people's work. And I'd amassed this sort of library of photographs in my head. And whenever I went to photograph there would be this sort of index that would go, that looks like a such and such a picture, that looks like a so-and-so picture. And the thing for me was trying to kind of get away from that. That was something that was kind of, was making the work very difficult, and making advancing very difficult. And what happened, and remember at this point, I've been photographing for sort of 8 or 9 years. It was suggested to me that I read a book. and that book's called The Green Child. And I won't go through the plot of The Green Child because it's a really weird book anyway, but if you get a chance, do read it. But the plot of the book is basically a man goes home after a long time away to a village in Yorkshire, I think. And the first thing he notices on his return is that the river is running in the wrong direction. The mill stream is running in the wrong direction. So essentially there's something wrong, something has changed. And he follows the mill stream and encounters a woman with pale green skin. And there's various things happen. But what then happens is they travel down the stream and they sink down below the surface of the earth when they reach the source of the stream. And they enter into the world, basically. And this book, I don't want to get too sort of whatever about it, but this book, something happened when I read the book. So it's like I became more conscious in a way of something that was happening. And the pictures, other people's pictures fell away. And I began to sort of only be conscious of what I was doing in a sense, in a way. And the other thing that happened was, I feel a bit stupid about this, but from reading this book about an entry into another world, I went back to the village, and again I've been photographing there for 8 or 9 years. I'd completely missed that somebody had built a network of tree houses in one of the wooded areas of the village. And it was as if, from reading The Green Child, there was a sort of level of consciousness in a way, or seeing that happened that didn't happen before. And I felt sort of capable or able to bring something else to it. I think it was a kind of trying to sort of open up what I was actually thinking about. And all of this was because of conversations with people. And it was an opening up of the work and a kind of almost a rediscovery of what it was about. And I think in some ways that is it becomes, I suppose it's about being honest, as honest as possible about what you're doing and why you're doing it and why you're sort of compelled to go back to these places and try to figure out what's going on. So the other big change as well was I went from using a 5.4 camera to a 10.8 camera, and that made an enormous difference. And the enormous difference was because I could use a 5.4 camera quickly. I have to actually fight with a 10.8 camera to make it work. And that, in some ways, diverted my attention somewhere else and made making pictures a different experience, a much more kind of, I suppose, it's a different form of concentration, I guess. And that changed the nature of what I was doing. And so, having all these sort of influences acting upon the work, I was able to kind of carry it forward and begin to make something that was, the big difference was I started to enjoy taking photographs, which I hadn't done for a very long time, and started to kind of be able to think through, by making photographs, think through what was sort of going on, what was my relationship with the place. And really at the heart of it is this sort of difficulty, I guess, with where you're from, and dealing with the sort of facts of your life and other people's lives around you. And it's difficult in some ways because I wish it wasn't about guilt, and in some ways it is about guilt. It's about the fact that I went away and I could do these things that I wanted to do and make the work that I wanted to make, and so on and so forth. But I've been going back there for nearly 13 years to make this work, and it carries on. It still carries on. The one thing that it's become a sort of joke amongst my friends. I'm never going to finish this, and that, you know, I'll be going back 13 years from now, possibly to kind of to tweak it and to make it better or to change it. I don't know if that's the case, but I think that it has its own life. I've started sort of other work now and other projects, and that's kind of taken the kind of the pressure off this really in some ways. And I haven't photographed in the village for over a year because in some ways there are times when I just can't still. I don't really know where to go with it. But as a project, as something that's kind of ongoing and something that's very close to me, I want to sort of get it right in a funny way, because I don't think it's right yet. The other thing to say is that in a second you'll start to see some portraits. And the thing about those portraits, when they actually turn up, is how difficult they are to make. In preparation for this, I had to look back at lots of work that I'd done over the time that I was sort of pursuing this, and I worked out that I made one good portrait about every 3 or 4 years, which isn't really a fantastic testament to my ability to make pictures, but it's almost as if I can't govern what makes it work. There are so many hundreds of pictures that portraits that just don't work. The position of the camera is the same, the photographer is the same, everything is the same. It's just it's them. It's nothing to do with me in a way. And sadly, even using sort of 10:8 and shooting less film and taking more time over it, my hit rate is still astonishingly poor. And I think the portraits are kind of they're the thing that I've got to go back to, I think, because I can try and become a better landscape photographer, but seemingly I can't have any effect on the portraits. And the other thing is there's no one around, especially in the winter. Very difficult to find people. And when I first started doing the project, I talked to the police, and I talked to sort of local government agencies about, you know, because who was this idiot walking around Arley with a camera? And so I talked to the police, and the policeman who was responsible for the village said something really interesting. He said, we hate going there. He said it's one of the most unfriendly places I've ever been in my life. He said, and I remember he said, you beat a dog 3 times and it doesn't come back. And that's how the police felt about being there. It's still very insular, even, you know, being sort of 20 and 10 miles from these sort of centres. It is like another world, and for me it's become a way of thinking and making pictures. It's the place where I go to make pictures and think about making pictures. And it isn't the village anymore. It's, in some ways, doesn't bear any resemblance to the place as you would see it if you visited it. It's completely a product of my imagination. And I got to know a local painter in the village, and he's a really interesting man. And he said, would you put a show up in the church hall, basically? And he hadn't seen any of the pictures at this stage. And I showed him, I sent this pretty much to him in an email. And he said, he sort of wrote an email back and sort of said, I don't really know what to think. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, do you hate it? Do you hate the place? And I said, no, I don't hate it at all. But, you know, as you've probably seen today, it's very difficult to try and explain what it's, you know, in inverted commas, about. Because it's about lots of things. It's about somewhere that's a very particular place, but could almost be anywhere. It's about me, and, you know, some of those things I've talked about. But it's, in a way, it's not about that village. It just happens to be there. But it's definitely not about the things that I first thought it was. And I suppose one needs to allow that to happen. It's just taken a long time. I was only supposed to do it for 2 years. But it got out of hand. And that's the last picture.